Today we're making this Firefly effect. I'm calling it Fireflies because that's the most universal way to refer to this. Of course, you can use this for a lot of things. Personally, I made this to go with this visual effect here, which I might do a tutorial on in the future as well. This is an experience orb drop, so I'm going to be putting this Firefly effect in a graveyard area, kind of like implying that these are like the lost souls of the people in the graveyard. So it's a bit of environmental storytelling there. You can use this effect for a lot of things. As per usual, the project file with this effect in it will be down below in the description through my Patreon. But for now, it's time to get started. So this is a new 3D project based on the HD render pipeline. This should also work in the universal render pipeline, so don't you worry about that. Then we can simply go to create, visual effects, visual effect graph, and we'll call this fireflies constant. We're going to be making two variations of this. One that just spawns in the fireflies once, and ones that will spawn in new ones, which both of those have their own up and down sides. We can just drag this in and it'll make a game object with this visual effect as a component. And now if we go closer to that, we disable all the gizmos so that we can see what we're doing. This is the standard effect that we're going to get. So let's double click our firefly asset, which will open up our visual effect. We're going to get these side by side so that we have a preview of what we're working with and the actual graph itself. And we're going to start with the constant one. So instead of the spawn rate, we'll delete that. And while having the spawn block selected, pressing the space button, we'll type in spawn single bursts. Then down here, we can make a new variable and we'll make a float for the count, which we can hook up to, of course, the count here. So now if we increase this, which let's make this a little bit bigger, and let's say by default this is set to 100, and we compile this thing, we can see it spawns in less than 100. That's because in initialize particle, we also have a capacity, which just tells this system this is the maximum amount of particles you're allowed to have at once. So let's set that to, you might say, also 100. We're actually going to set that to much more. This is the maximum that any version of this system will ever be able to have. So 10,000 is probably as high as we're ever going to go over like a very large area. Then a little technical stuff. We need to set up the bounds here. So we have the bounds by default are set to recorded. We're going to set these bounds manually instead. What these bounds are is that tells Unity when it should or shouldn't render these particles. When the bounds isn't in view, it's going to stop rendering the entire system. So if your bounds are smaller than where your particles end up being at, you can see how that's a problem. So we can make a vector 3 for that and call it bounds and just hook that up into the size value here. And let's by default set that to 100 by 100 by 100. That's a rather big bounds area, but you don't want to have this thing disappear when you look away from it for a second. We're going to remove the set lifetime because we actually want these particles to never die. And we're also going to remove the set size over life here because of course it doesn't have a lifetime now when we compile. And the same with set color over life. We're going to delete that too. And now you can see the particles never die and they just keep expanding. That's not what we want. So we're going to also delete the default set velocity. And instead, in the update particle, we'll add a turbulence force, which you can see here now. It's this one particle is doing something. So we're going to set the spawn point for the particles next so that they spawn all across our wanted area. And we'll do that with a set position. And we're going to be using a shape for that. And that's going to be the arc cone. Now you'll see it spawns those on the surface of a cone object. We can change the position mode here. I'll zoom in a little bit so that you can read a bit better. From surface to volume, which means that instead it will start using the entire volume of the object that we specify. We're using a cone here, which if we visualize that, this is where the particles all start spawning in. So we want to actually make that into a cylinder. So the top and bottom radius should be the same. As a matter of fact, we're going to make that into a variable float as well. So let's set that to, for instance, 1 and call this radius. And if we drag that in here, we can just connect it up to the base and the top radius. And now we have one value for both of those. We'll also make a float float here for the height of this spawner, which by default will also set to being 1. Now you can see this is our default shape, but the particles are moving a little bit too much. So what we'll do is we can set down the intensity here, but you might want in some cases to have the intensity be higher than others. If you're in a very windy area in your game, it makes sense that these particles would float around more. So we'll of course make a float for that as well, and we'll call that turbulence, which we can hook up into the intensity of the turbulence here. And see now that it's 0, it's not applying any force to it whatsoever. If we put this to 0.1, they start moving around very, very slowly. And you can go even lower than 0.1. We can go 0.05, and they are moving even slower in this case. Then coming down here, the main texture we're going to change from default particle to default dash particle. That just changes from this development texture to something that we can actually use in a game. And that is pretty much all there is to this whole system. Now, we can add a couple of other things. So within initialize particle, we'll also add a set color, for instance, which allows us to add a color variable to this whole stack as well, which we'll just call color. And by default, let's set that to like a nice green. And what we can do is we can actually increase the intensity here by quite a bit, which means that we're going over a value of 1 in brightness, and that'll give that little glowing effect. Because as you can see, this isn't really glowing, and we see this like faded black edge around it. That doesn't look particularly nice. But if we then hook up this color into it, we can see, hey, now we have these green glowing orbs, which instantly looks a lot better. If you want to, you can also set a size for them, which you can do in much the same way. We can get a float for the size, which, well, by default, I like to set this just to 1. And instead of doing the 0.1, which is the default size we have in Unity, what I personally like to do is I like to just divide the number that we create here by 10. That way I feel like you have a little bit more control over the actual size of the particles. And to make this slightly better even, we can go over here as we have the set size selected, and we can turn random to per component. That'll give us a minimum value and a maximum value. So if we just multiply the same value going into the A by, let's say, 2, and put that into the B, now we have a size difference from about 0.1 to about 0.2, which of course you can then decrease this a little bit. You will have to recompile every single time you want to see the difference though. That's a little bit too small maybe, and you can do this within the editor on a per instance basis, but this is just the default values. And there we go, we've got our first one. We've got our first set of fireflies here. So now going to our firefly constant object, we can see all of these properties that we've just made. They're all exposed, so we can increase the count to like 500 instead. Again, because it's a one-time spawn burst, these effects don't take effect until you turn it off and turn it back on again. And now you can see there's a bunch more of them. If you want to have them all be a lot larger, we can change that to 4, and now it's one big glowing blob of particles. And that is immediately also the downside to this version of the system, is that you can't really make much dynamic changes to it because it just spawns them in once. They don't die, they keep around forever. So if you want the idea that these fireflies are things that are floating around in your area and you don't ever want to have a player see one disappear, this is a very good option. But it's kind of limited in dynamically like changing its color, for instance. So for that, you want to have a system that spawns in particles and then lets them die as it spawns in new ones. Luckily, it's just a small change to accomplish that. So let's delete this fireflies constant and let's make a fireflies spawner. Just drag it into the scene again to have a reference of what we're working with. And now we're going to be working on firefly spawner. So we're going to change a couple of things around. First and foremost, the single burst we're going to delete, and we're going to go back to constant spawn rate, which we can also just hook up the count into. And as you can see, it's now constantly spawning these things. You're going to want to set your count value for this a fair bit lower though. And we're going to add back in the lifetime. So set lifetime. We want the particles to die at some point again. Otherwise, it's going to keep spawning them until it reaches this capacity that we've set up here. And we don't really want that. So we can do the same here with the lifetime as we did with the size. And that is setting the random to per component so that every component component individually, every particle that is, has its own lifetime. And we'll make a variable for lifetime as well. We'll call it lifetime. By default, I personally like setting this to a pretty high value, something like 50 for a system like this. And we can do the same thing here by just like multiplying this value by 2 might be a bit much, so let's multiply it by 1.5 in this case for the B component. That gives every particle a slightly randomized lifetime. Then in our output particle quad, we're going to add a size over lifetime, a set size over lifetime specifically. And as you can see, it starts you off with this curve, which actually works decently well. I personally like a curve that goes from 0 to 1 very, very quickly, then keeps at 1 for a little while. You can drag these handles around to make this a straight line, and then back to 0. Especially since the lifetime is so long, these little very steep bumps actually still pretty slow with a lifetime of 50. But you might be saying, this is maybe not really what I'm looking for. I mean, it looks interesting, granted, but not really what I'm looking for. And that's because at this point, it's overwriting the size. So what we want to do is we want to multiply. So it takes the size value that we gave it and multiplies it by whatever this curve tells it to do. So now they fade in from being very small. They stay as being very small for a little while. And then towards the end of the lifetime, which is 50 seconds, it's going to take a while until we see some fading out. They also scale back down once they start to despawn. And as you can see, our emitter still is emitting quite a lot of these things. So let's add it back to like maybe 8 instead. Recompile to start it off from the start. And since our lifetime is so long for these particles, it's going to take us a while with every single change we make to see how that actually looks. So what we can do is in your assets here, we can click this once, and then in our inspector, we get some properties that we can change for this VFX graph. Our pre-warm total time, we can set to 50, which means that it's when it spawns in, when it starts the particle system, it'll do it as if it's already existed for 50 seconds. So all the actual spawns for the particles are already in. So this is the particle amount that we're going to see in the system itself. And 8 still might be a little bit too much. So let's set this, for instance, to 4. And we recompile it to see the changes immediately. And this is starting to look a little bit more like it. We can, of course, also set our radius to being a little bit larger so that the particles get spread out a little bit more on spawn. And just like this, we have our Firefly system in 2 different variations. So if you want to watch through these 2 different variations, play around with the finished systems yourself, link down below to the Patreon where you can download this whole project file. As always, if there's anything else you would like to see me do, if you want to see the tutorial to make this little experience orb system that I made, it's actually not that complicated. It's just a lot of particle systems working together. Do let me know down below in the comments, or if there's anything else you would like me to make, do let me know down in the comments and I will try to get to it. Until the next time, I'll see you back then. Bye.